There are things a person carries that never fully leave them. Not the dramatic things, not the losses that get written about and remembered and turned into the official story of a life, the quiet things, the specific weight of a voice that is no longer available, the particular way a person moved through a room, the exact texture of a memory so old it has become something closer to weather, a condition of the interior rather than a recollection. Ray Charles carried his mother Aretha Robinson for his entire life. She died in 1945 when Ray was 15 years old and she was 31. She died young, of circumstances that poverty made inevitable and geography made worse. She died before she could see what her son became, before the records and the Grammy Awards and the crowds of thousands singing back the words he had written in hotel rooms and stairwells and small hours of mornings she never witnessed. She died when Ray was still a boy at the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, still learning what his life was going to be, still in the early stages of understanding that the gifts he had been given were extraordinary in ways he could not yet measure. He carried her anyway, through every version of himself that came after, through the Seattle years and the Atlantic years and the ABC, Paramount years and the decades of concerts and records and the slow, immense accumulation of a legacy that she never saw coming because she did not live long enough to see it arrive. This is the story of what that carrying looked like. Not the public version, not the interviews where Ray Charles spoke carefully and with dignity about his mother's influence. The private version, the version that lived in the music, that shaped the way he sang and what he chose to sing, and why certain songs hit him in ways that had nothing to do with their commercial potential and everything to do with a woman who died at 30, one in rural Florida, and left her blind son standing at her graveside with no map for the rest of his life. And it is the story of a recording session, one specific afternoon in a New York studio, when something happened that no one who was present that day ever fully explained, and that Ray Charles himself spoke about only once, in a private conversation years later, in language so sparse and precise that the people who heard it understood they were receiving something rare. To pard onanti e Robinson gavi him, to understand what Ray Charles lost when his mother died, you have to understand what she had built. Aretha Robinson was a sharecropper's daughter who raised two sons largely alone in Greenville, Florida, in conditions that offered almost no structural support and a great deal of structural hostility. She worked constantly, laundry, fieldwork, whatever was available, and she raised Ray with a philosophy that was, in its own way, a form of radical defiance of everything the world was telling her about what her blind black son could expect from his life. She refused to let Ray be defined by what he had lost. When Ray's sight began failing at 4 and was gone entirely by 7, Aretha made decisions that most people in her position would not have made. She insisted he learn to do things for himself. She refused to carry him through tasks he could accomplish independently. She taught him the stove, the laundry, the layout of the house, the path to the road. All of it done without sight. All of it done through touch and memory and the particular spatial intelligence that develops in people who navigate by hearing rather than by vision. "You're blind, not stupid," she told him. These words were not comfort. They were instruction. They were the philosophical foundation of everything Ray Charles built afterward. Every negotiation, every creative decision, every refusal to accept the limitations that other people wanted to assign to him. But there was something else Aretha gave him that was harder to name and more important than the practical lessons. She gave him the sense that he was worth fighting for. Not in a sentimental way, not in the way of easy parental love that asks nothing difficult of anyone. In the way of a woman who made hard choices daily on behalf of a child she believed in completely, and who communicated that belief not through words primarily but through the fact of her continued investment. She was still there. Every morning she was still there. In a world that had given Ray Charles very little reason to trust in the permanence of anything. His sight was gone, his brother had drowned. Poverty was a constant ambient threat. His mother's continued presence was the primary evidence that some things held. And then she was gone. The specific details of Aretha Robinson's death were not things Ray Charles discussed extensively in public. What he said consistently and across decades of interviews was that losing her was the single most devastating event of his life. More than the blindness. More than anything that came before or after. The blindness had taken his sight. His mother's death had taken the person who had taught him how to live without it. He stood at her graveside at 15, in a cemetery in Florida, and felt the full weight of a future that would now be navigated entirely without her. No voice in his ear telling him what he was capable of. No presence in the room confirming, simply by being there, that he was worth the space he occupied. He had the music. He had always had the music. And from that point forward, the music was not simply a career or a gift or a form of expression. It was the place where his mother still lived. Two-part TWOT Ray Charles rarely spoke directly about how his mother's death shaped his music. He was not, by temperament, a man who translated his private emotional life into public statements. He was precise, guarded in the specific way of people who have learned that the world does not always handle their interior life carefully, and he communicated the deeper things through the music rather than around it. But the music communicated them clearly enough for people who listen carefully. There is a quality in Ray Charles's voice that critics and musicians and ordinary listeners have been trying to name accurately for decades. It is not simply sadness. The voice is too alive, too physically present, too capable of joy and playfulness for sadness to be the right word. It is not simply longing, though longing is closer. It is something more specific than either, the sound of a person who has loved something completely and lost it and gone on living anyway, carrying the loss not as a wound but as a permanent feature of the interior landscape. Grief that has been fully inhabited rather than avoided. Grief that has become over time a form of depth rather than a form of damage. People who heard Ray Charles sing Georgia on My Mind were not simply hearing a man describe nostalgia for a place. They were hearing a man who knew, in the most direct and irreversible way, what it meant to lose something you could never fully return to. The song worked, the recording worked, specifically and permanently, in the way it did, because the emotional reality behind it was not manufactured. It was not performed. It was the actual documented truth of a man's experience, channeled through 3 minutes of music with such precision and completeness that listeners who had never set foot in Georgia and had no personal connection to Ray Charles's life felt it as their own. That quality came from Aretha Robinson, not from the specific content of any song she had taught him. She was not a musician in any formal sense, but from the specific emotional texture of her loss, from what her absence had permanently installed in the interior of the person she had raised. Ray Charles had learned, from losing her, what human love costs when it is real. And that knowledge, that specific, personal, irreplaceable knowledge, was the thing that made his music feel true to people who had never met him and would never know his story. But there was one afternoon when that knowledge surfaced in a way that was different from all the others. Two-part THRETHE Afterno ENT Studio was a recording session in New York. The year was somewhere in the late 1950s. The exact date is not preserved in any documentation that has become part of the public record, which is itself part of the story. What happened that afternoon was not documented because the people present did not fully understand what they were witnessing until it was over, and by then the moment for documentation had passed. The session had been scheduled for a specific set of songs. The musicians were assembled, the arrangements were prepared, the studio was set up and ready. Ray Charles arrived on time, as he always did. Punctuality was one of his absolute professional standards, a form of respect he extended to everyone working with him regardless of their position in the session hierarchy. The first few hours went normally. Takes were recorded, playbacks were reviewed, adjustments were made. Ray Charles in a recording studio was a specific and consistent presence, completely focused, technically exacting, willing to do as many takes as necessary to get what he was hearing in his head onto the tape, but impatient with imprecision and unwilling to accept a performance that was merely adequate when something true was available. Then, in the middle of the session, during a break while the engineers were making adjustments, Ray Charles sat down at the studio piano, not the piano he had been using for the session, but a smaller upright in the corner of the room that had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and began to play something that was not on the session schedule. The musicians who were present, scattered around the studio on their break, talking quietly, drinking coffee, gradually stopped talking. Not because anyone signaled them to, because the sound demanded their attention in a way that was different from the session music. Different from anything they had heard that afternoon. What Ray Charles was playing was not a finished song. It was something being constructed in real time, a melody that kept returning to a particular phrase, a harmonic movement that repeated and developed and refused to resolve in any of the expected directions. It sounded, to the musicians listening, like something being worked out rather than something being performed, like a conversation rather than a statement. And then Ray Charles began to sing, not words, not lyrics. A sound that was closer to what gospel singers call a moan, a vocal expression that predates and underlies formal lyric, that communicates in the register of pure feeling before language arrives to organize it. A sound that came from somewhere in the body rather than somewhere in the mind. The musicians looked at each other, no one spoke. No one moved toward a recording device. The session engineer later said that he had thought about reaching for the tape machine and had decided not to, that the moment felt private in a way that recording would violate, though he could not articulate why he felt that clearly enough to justify the decision in any professional sense. Ray Charles played and sang for perhaps 8 minutes, perhaps 10. No one timed it precisely. When he stopped, he sat at the piano for a long moment without moving. Then he stood, walked back to the main studio area and said, to no one specifically, to the room, that he thought they should take the next song from the top. The session continued. No one asked what had just happened. Two perfu are my timas years later, many years, in a private conversation that was not recorded and was recounted afterward by the person who had been present, Ray Charles spoke about that afternoon. He did not identify it as the specific afternoon the story has always placed it on. He spoke about it as a type of moment that happened to him sometimes, particularly in recording studios, particularly when he was working on material that required access to something very deep in himself. He described it as the moment when the gap between what the music was asking for and what he was capable of producing became temporarily very small. He said that his mother had a sound, not a singing voice. She had not been a singer in any formal sense. A sound she made when she was working, when she was doing laundry or cooking or moving through the small spaces of their home in Greenville. A kind of low, continuous, conscious vocal tone that she produced without thinking about it, the way some people hum and some people talk to themselves. A sound that meant she was present, that everything was as it should be, that the world had not contracted to crisis. He said that sometimes, when he was very deep in the music, he heard that sound, not as a hallucination, not as anything he would have described in supernatural terms, as a quality of the music itself, a register it reached that resonated with something very old and very specific in his memory, a frequency at which the music and the memory of her occupied the same space. He said that on those occasions he did not try to capture it or direct it, or turn it into something that could be used. He simply let it be present for as long as it lasted, and when it was over, he went back to work. That was the afternoon in the studio. That was what the musicians had heard without understanding what they were hearing. Ray Charles at the intersection of music and memory, at the place where the technical craft he had spent his entire life developing became temporarily transparent, became a medium through which something that could not be said any other way was briefly, completely said. Part of VTH Sues Tihat Karidhr. Ray Charles never released a song that he described, publicly or in any documented way, as being about his mother. This is important. It would have been easy, commercially and emotionally, to make that connection explicit. To record something called Aretha or Mother, or any of the obvious titles that would have signaled the content clearly and given listeners the framework to understand what they were hearing. He did not do this. The songs that carry Aretha Robinson's presence do not announce it. They do not explain themselves. They communicate through the quality of the feeling rather than through the content of the lyric. Georgia on My Mind carries her because Georgia is where she was from, and the specific quality of longing in Ray's recording is not generic nostalgia. It is the longing of a man who knows exactly what he is longing for and knows equally exactly that he cannot have it back. You Don't Know Me carries her because its central subject, the experience of loving someone who cannot see the full reality of what you feel, operates equally as a description of romantic love and as a description of the grief of a child whose parent died before the child had the language or the years to fully communicate what they felt. Cry carries her most directly of all the recordings, though no one has ever said so publicly and Ray Charles certainly never said so on the record. Cry is a song about the specific release of grief that has been held too long, the permission to stop containing it and let it out completely. It is one of the rawest performances in his catalog, the voice pushed to its edge, the technical control that characterized almost everything else he recorded temporarily suspended in favor of something more urgent and less careful. He recorded it in one take. The engineer asked if he wanted to do another. Ray Charles said no. These songs were not written about Aretha Robinson. They were not dedicated to her, not named for her, not explained in any liner notes as being connected to her. But they carried her. They were saturated with the specific emotional knowledge that her life and death had given her son, the knowledge of what love costs, what loss feels like from the inside, what it means to keep living after the person who most completely believed in you is no longer present to confirm that belief. That knowledge, placed in service of songs that were ostensibly about entirely other things, is what made those recordings survive everything. It is what made Georgia on My Mind into a state song. It is what made You Don't Know Me into a standard that dozens of artists have covered without capturing what Ray Charles did with it. It is what made the Cry and Cry feel like something that belonged to the listener as much as to the performer. Aretha Robinson died at 31. She never heard any of these recordings. She never knew that her son would become one of the most significant musicians of the 20th century, or that the things she had built into him, the refusal to accept limitation, the knowledge that he was worth fighting for, the sound she made moving through their small house in Greenville, would surface, decades later, in recordings that hundreds of millions of people would carry through their own lives as though the songs had been written specifically for them. She never knew any of it. But it all came from her. Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004. He had been recording until close to the end. The body of work he left behind is vast, varied, and marked throughout by the quality that his listeners have always recognized without always being able to name. At his memorial service, the people who spoke about him returned repeatedly to the same observation that Ray Charles's music made people feel seen, not entertained, not moved in the pleasurable, temporary way of entertainment. Seen, recognized, encountered in the specific privacy of their own interior experience by something that seemed to know them from the inside. This is the rarest thing a piece of music can do. It requires the artist to have access to something true, not technically true, not biographically accurate in any documentable sense, but emotionally true in the way that resonates with human experience across every possible variation of circumstance and background and personal history. Ray Charles had that access because he had paid for it. He had paid for it at 15, standing at his mother's grave in a Florida cemetery with no map for what came next. He had paid for it in every year that followed, carrying her absence alongside everything else he carried, allowing it to inform without overwhelming, using it as the source of a depth that could not have been constructed any other way. The musicians who were present in that New York studio on the afternoon when Ray Charles sat down at the upright piano in the corner and played something that was not on the session schedule. Those musicians spent years describing what they had heard to other musicians and to interviewers. They consistently reached for the same language, that it sounded like a conversation, that it sounded like something being communicated to someone specific, that it sounded, in a way that none of them could fully rationalize, like something being returned. A man at a piano in a recording studio in New York, playing a melody for a woman in a cemetery in Florida who had been dead for more than a decade and who would never hear it. And somehow, through the specific architecture of his grief and his gift, reaching her anyway, that is the story the music was always telling. That is the frequency at which Ray Charles sang in every recording he ever made, whether the song was about Georgia or about a woman who left or about the good times that never seemed so good. His mother's frequency, the one she had given him without knowing she was giving it, the one he spent his entire life learning how to use,